if we're trying to predict for, let's say, the whole sector in containers, I know predicting is super hard and forecasting is also super hard, but there are some very interesting dynamics going on right now. We are maybe getting out of COVID soon. Supply chain has been very much disturbed by this. So just give us a bird's eye view. What are you seeing? Are there something you're very interesting to see how it will play out? Because obviously you have the inflation and price index as well, right? So there's a lot of components to be interested in right now.
No, absolutely. I mean, if you look at shipping in general, and that's obviously not just container shipping, it's actually the global economy. The whole scheme of energy transition will impact us globally and shipping in particular, of course. Undoubtedly, it will play a key role over the next 5, 10, maybe 20 years. I think for the next 2 to 3 years, it will have an impact, but not, you will not be able to replace the whole fleet within that period. So it will be a transitional process that will be a key scheme. I think in the more 2 to 3 year horizon, especially in container shipping, I believe we will see a focus on supply chain resilience and reliability, and people actually now willing to pay up for it. Since 2009, in container shipping, people earned money, but that was more the freight forwarders, the shippers, and less the liner companies and the owners. And now with this disruptive event of COVID, which is now already 18 months down or into really disrupting the supply chains, I expect people are willing to pay up, and paying up doesn't necessarily only mean higher price. It also means longer periods and more contract durations. And that's good for the liner companies and for owners like us. And I think this is the trend that will not stop, because people have seen how vulnerable the supply chain is and the consequences of this. And by having short contracts, you would still be vulnerable. And we don't know what might happen down the road. Maybe it's not another COVID lockdown, supply chain disruptive event, but it might be something similar. And I think people have learned how important it is to have a functional supply chain and how bad it is to have a non-functional supply chain. So I think this is a scheme also in terms of strategic priorities for shippers and people who are highly reliant upon the supply chain functioning, that play a role, and that will play a role. So people will pay up for it, and that will be seen over the next 2 to 3 years in container shipping in my book. And this is really interesting to play out. And secondly, in terms of demand and supply, because that's eventually the driver, next 12 to 18 months, there is limited supply growth. After that, we see more and more orders. Container shipping has seen significant orders last year, especially in the larger sizes, to a lesser extent in our sizes. But I would still expect a moderate demand growth of, let's say, 2 to 4%. So overall, I'm very positive for the next 2 to 3 years. And then I see energy transition really reshaping the industry in a way that might be quite dramatic over the next 5 to 15, 20 years.
How will this play out for sort of the FedEx, etc., DHL? Because obviously, being a ship owner, right, you're not responsible for the whole chain, right? So there's someone who has to pay this, right? So obviously, if you talk to a CEO for FedEx, he will have a very clear standpoint on what he thinks is important going forward. Can you just explain these dynamics and the different stakeholders in the supply chain?
Sure, and I mean, obviously, you have a shipper who has, for example, a parcel with a few boxes, right? And they put that in a container with FedEx or with Kühne + Nagel or other freight forwarders. They assemble it, put it in one container, and then that container, picks up the different parcels and then gets loaded on a truck. That truck goes to a terminal, is being loaded on a vessel operated by Maersk, potentially owned by us, right? And then this vessel goes on the sea voyage and arrives, let's say, in the US from China, gets discharged, and the box goes on a rail and then on a truck and gets delivered to a supermarket. So this is, the whole journey of a container, and it's fascinating actually to see that. And it's even more complex if you look at a refrigerated container, if you have perishable goods, for example. So that's the way it works. But I mean, to your point on FedEx, I mean, in the end, if you look at a pair of jeans, a bottle of wine, which by the way is being transported in the container as well, the additional costs from slight increase in freight rates is marginal. We're talking about 2 or 3 cents on a pair of jeans. So that's why I'm also, and that's different in container shipping. That's why I mentioned this topic of the value, right? The value of that is on board of a container ship is significantly higher than on a tanker or a dry bulk vessel. So you have more goods that can digest the additional cost. And in the end, the end user or the consumer will have to pay for it, unfortunately. But I think it's then, distributed more evenly on certain goods, pair of sneakers, pair of jeans, bottle of wine. It's a few cents in total, and that will eventually also pay for the energy transition in my book when it comes to container shipping.
It's very, very fascinating. If you look at this trajectory, so what's the worst case scenario? Like a black swan or a white swan, call it whatever you want, but do you have to mention war to get you afraid of something? Or do you see a worst case scenario where you actually have to protect your downside?
Well, of course, I mean, the situation in the Ukraine, or maybe potentially Taiwan, China, I mean, these are concerning developments, not just on a let's say personal level, but also for the industry. It will have implications. Of course, I mean, we as a company have contracts, and then vessels will go different routes. The Ukraine and Taiwan in itself doesn't really ruin the picture from a global trade perspective, but it will obviously affect a trading pattern. It will affect the way we operate vessels. Of course, always very important. Actually, the most important aspect from our perspective is crew safety, right? I mean, we need to make sure that we operate very safely and that our crew is protected and the well-being of the crew is super important. So there are implications of that nature that could change the picture. But I mean, as an example, not a war in war terms, but a trade war, as we've seen between China and the US, had an impact on the market. Not necessarily really on the pricing, but on sentiment and on people not being sure whether to commit into capex or the likes, and then it had an effect on container shipping. So that is a risk. Again, the longer the contracts, the better it is then also evenly shared along the supply chain. If we just had ships on short contracts, we would be way more exposed. Now we have a good backlog, and also the liner companies, Maersk and others, they also have longer contracts now. So there's more visibility on the ship owner side, on the liner operator side, and now the, let's say, risk is more shared also with shippers and freight forwarders because they have to commit to longer contracts. So I think the industry has stabilized. The balance sheets also of owners and in particular liner companies has improved significantly. People always look at the high rates and say, oh, can that be sustainable? Well, it can if everyone uses the capital or allocates the capital in a way that they also de-risk their balance sheet and do not expose themselves to more and more risk. And that is certainly something that we will do, not just to pay out dividends, but also to de-risk the balance sheet. And the good news is the cash flow is so rich that we can afford it, and the liners do the same. So I think this is very important going forward. But to your point, obviously the certain developments globally raise concerns, but I don't think at this stage that there's any black swan tangibly there, but you never know. We haven't seen COVID coming, and in the beginning it was a nightmare for container shipping, and now it's obviously the opposite for container shipping as such.